Welcome to the Print soft cover, where we launch books, and this is our online platform to do so. And today we have a guest, Mr. Vikrant Pandey. He, in fact, is an IIM Bangalore graduate who has a work of translating. He's translated around 12 Marathi books into English, and his latest offering was in 2021 called In the Footsteps of Rama, which he co-authored. But today he will be talking about his new book, The SBI Story. Congratulations, sir, on that book, and thank you for joining us. And I have the book with me. It's called The SBI Story, 2 Centuries of Banking. So basically, as the book and its name suggests, this is about the State Bank of India, the largest bank in the country. And it talks about its history, which dates back to 2 centuries, like from 19th century until 21st century, how SBI evolved, how was it connected to the economic progress of the country, all of which we will be talking to Mr. Vikrant Pandey. Thank you, sir, for joining us. So let's begin this conversation. First, I wanted to ask you is, how did this idea come into being? Like, why did you decide to write on the SBI story, which is not a very typical story, but it talks about its history and it takes us back to the 19th century?
Yeah, Purva, actually, the idea was really serendipitous. I was talking to my editor in Amazon, and I stumbled upon an article in the Hindu, I think it was the Hindu Business Line, which spoke in glowing terms about an SBI museum. I never knew that a museum of State Bank of India existed. So I was very curious because the article mentioned that it's a fascinating piece of history which is preserved there. So I actually went to Calcutta. And when I went to Kolkata in the local head office on One Strand Road, there is a beautiful museum which reminds you of like a European museum. The way it is lit, the way the artifacts are displayed, it's really very impressive. And I was surprised I didn't know that the origin of State Bank goes back to early 19th century or 1806 to be precise. So I said, this is 200 years of history, which has been, and thanks to SBI that they have documented that, and thanks to the British tradition of each and every article of the bank, right from the Presidency Bank days, actually archived in the SBI Museum. So I got a lot of stuff there, which was very well documented. So I found that this is a treasure which really needs to be told to people. 2 centuries of banking, it's, I think, probably one of India's oldest companies in that sense, going back to 200 years. And most people don't know about it. So I said, this is something I need to write.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, like not many people know about it, that SBI is, 2 centuries old. People would be like, oh, SBI, we know, which is a quite old bank, but not 2 centuries. So definitely that is something that you have also mentioned in the book, how, the history dates back to the 19th century. But so it has a pre-independence and a post-independence, like it is divided in 2 eras. But I want to understand, which you have also mentioned in the book, and you can tell to our viewers about it, is that, how difficult was it for the SBI, which was in fact formed in 1955 in the current status? So how difficult was it to shed off its colonial past and, get into the current form, or rather from bank of classes to, say, a bank of masses?
I think the very thought of, there had been a lot of clamor when the Imperial Bank was formed. So it's kind of actually in 3 parts. The Presidency Bank era, which is from 1800 till almost 1921, 100 years of the Presidency Banks, which is the Bank of Bengal, Bank of Bombay, and Bank of Madras, as they were called, which were made into the Presidency Bank in Imperial Bank of India in 1921, which was also like the Reserve Bank for India before Reserve Bank was formed. And the very fact that the nationalization of the Imperial Bank was seen as a requirement for India now having become independent. Mind you, SBI was made in 1955, which is almost 8 years after India got independence. It took 8 years for people to be able to convince the government that we need to nationalize this bank. And there was a lot of clamor against it as well. J.R.D. Tata very famously objected to it because he had suffered Air India, where India had been taken away, Tata Airlines, and had been made into Air India. He wasn't happy. And his question was, why do you want to take a good, profitable entity and convert that into a national asset? And there was a very strong reason because, as you rightly said, from classes to masses, there was a desperate need for bank. That time, the number of branches probably were a few hundred branches in India. And the size of India required thousands and thousands of bank branches to be able to service that time the population of something like 40 crores of 40 crores of Indians. And the only way to do that was to have a government bank which is willing to go and service agriculture, MSME, small traders, businessmen. The only way it could be done was to have a national bank which had the support of the government, which was willing to open branches without seeing that each branch is necessarily profitable, and then go out and really create a banking network, so to say, a backbone for India to really come up. And so it immediately transformed itself, to answer your question, from being an imperialistic, very arrogant, snooty bank to a bank which really looked at saying, I need to go and service Indians, agriculturists, laborers, small enterprises, and really make them successful. So that was the photo which we started.
Yeah, and I think at that point of time, after independence, the political discourse was about, having socialist ideas as well. So I think that kind of also helped the bank maybe to, just get into that mode and try to reach to the masses where, there aren't any banks. And in fact, at that point of time, how difficult was it for people, for the bank to convince people to come on board? Because up until that point of time, even the local masses, in fact, even in villages and rural and far off places, they weren't very aware of, what a bank is or what is banking. So how difficult was it for the SBI to convince its people?
I think you're right. The socialist, angle which the government then had, the emergence of public sectors, because in oil refining or coal or steel manufacturing, I think SBI was a logical outcome of that we need to create a bank which is for the masses, which is a Bank of India for the Indians. And I think there was a lot of hunger because before that, there were money lenders. The presidency banks are not serving the common man. If you look at the requirement of a presidency bank or Imperial Bank to open a current account, you needed 500 rupees, which is a very large amount in, let's say, in the late 19th century. You had to put in 500 rupees to open a current account, when the average salary of an individual would be like 50 or 60 rupees a month. So there was a lot of unsatisfied, there was a latent hunger of people wanting to draw credit, wanting to take loans, not from a shark or a money lender or from the local private banks which are run by the princely states, but from a bank which was a national bank, which had the right amount of interest they were charging, and it was meant for people to come forward and deposit their money. So the whole idea of what we call as the whole savings initiative. India is known as a savings country. People are saving money in gold or in other forms. Started then looking at deposits in a bank as a much safer way to go about it. To employees, luckily, Purva, the Imperial Bank had set up a beautiful system of probationary officers. And even today, if you look at it, the SBI probationary officer exam is one of the most aspired exams in India. After the IAS, civil services, people look at the SBI PO as an exam where lakhs and lakhs of people appear for it. And to its credit, SBI has a fantastic system of probationary officers where they take these people at entry level, they groom them in their staff college, and then they join the bank as an officer. And all the people, all the chairmen and managing directors who have come till date from in the bank are people who join as a probationary officer. So that speaks a lot about the way the culture was built in the bank, which its foundations were laid by the Imperial Bank itself in 1921.
But as you just mentioned like a few minutes back, that there were apprehensions about going national, the nationalization process. There were apprehensions from including JRD Tata, like, someone like a JRD Tata. So, talking about nationalization and do you think at that point of time, it was the only way for SBI to go national? The nationalization was the only way forward for it to reach where it had to reach?
Yes,
Or was
I think in retrospect, I surely believe that if India did not have something like an SBI, it would have been very
hmm,
difficult to
hmm,
create the ecosystem of savings, deposits, lending, people borrowing money for agriculture, money for small enterprises. Would not have happened, because if you look at a private bank then, given that there are not enough methods by which one could assess risks, private banks would not have bothered to go beyond maybe 5 or 7 cities, or maybe at the most 20 cities in India. There was no way a private bank would look at getting into small towns and villages and really create the infrastructure what is required. Even today, Purva, very surprisingly, after 75 years of independence and almost SBI since 1955, even today the bank branch network is yet to reach its full potential. We have these small finance banks, we have micro finance companies which are providing micro credit to small borrowers. Even today, it still is a work in progress. So 75 years down the line, if it's a work in progress, I think in 1955 it was not just an urgent need, it was something which was had to be done, despite
right,
the JRD Tata and many other businessmen, despite the debates in the parliament. Finally the RBI and the finance minister pushed its way through, saying this is a must and we should go ahead. Well, the question could be asked whether you could have set up a bank completely on its own, or you should have nationalized Imperial Bank. That is a debate, but the Imperial Bank, having had its infrastructure and its legacy for 150 years, it made sense to just nationalize Imperial Bank rather than creating a new
right, right. And also, in your book, when we talk about SBI in its current form, quite a few number of like at least two chapters you have dedicated on its growth years and how you have talked about its chairpersons. So you've given quite a big emphasis on having a good chairperson at the initial, and how it was about trust at that point of time. In fact, you've also mentioned one anecdote if we talk about its pre-independence time about Governor General William Bettnick, that if there is a bank who is also so strict about rules even to the Governor General, then it is the bank to do business with. So the trust factor, how did SBI achieve that? Like even today, if we talk to any person, that person would be comfortable putting its money in SBI rather than in some private bank. So how did the trust factor achieved by SBI?
I think, yeah, you mentioned Lord William Bentinck, very, very good example that the ethics of creating the trust began almost 100 years back. But when SBI took up, and as you rightly said, some of the chairmen who came, and all the chairmen joined either the Imperial Bank or the State Bank of India as probationary officers. So they had grown from the roots. I think the even the design of the SBI logo, and I talk about that in my book as well in some detail, saying the logo was meant to represent that it is for a common man. A lot of
Yeah.
people sort of interpret that as a keyhole, that it is a key to success. Some people look at it as two concentric circles where the customer is in the center, where the bank is around. There are multiple ways people interpret that, but the trust, the underlying trust that there is while it does not have a sovereign guarantee, so to say, in the technical terms, that if the SBI deposits, you're not going to get a sovereign guarantee, but people believe that the bank represents solidity, the bank represents trust, the bank represents the government in some sense, and I can safely put my money behind it. You have to go back to what SBI did in the last 50, 60 years, in terms of the way, for example, their CSR. the corporate social responsibility, when it was not even a buzzword, when it was not even being talked about it. Now today it's a fashion and it's become compulsory by the government. SBI used to go out and encourage its officers. They used to hire people who are from a downtrodden classes, ex-convicts, for example. No bank would hire an ex-convict, but SBI would give loans to them, give them employment. People who are normally shunned by the society, these people were taken up by SBI. Either they were given loans or given jobs. Sports persons, a lot of sports people have their roots in SBI, where they were working as SBI officers. Unfortunately, now the sports quota has been stopped. But many of these things, SBI was a front runner in doing this, even when it was not either not fashionable or it was not compulsory as CSR is today. So a lot of these things contributed to creating trust. Does not get created overnight. It's a lot of small actions. I feel sometimes very hurt when you see memes against SBI. Somebody saying, why didn't Vijay Mallya get a loan because it was lunchtime? Usne bola baad mein aao. And while, it will always happen that when it's a very large entity like this, people would take pot shots at it. But you go to an SBI bank and you see the way there's the friendly, warm culture, which is even seen today. A lot of pensioners feel so comfortable that their money is being handled by SBI. They know that they won't be cheated. The money would come on time. Whenever they get good service. So trust gets built over a very, very long period, and one event can destroy that trust as well. So the chairmen have played a big role in that.
So that one event could destroy the trust. Here I want to ask, and maybe you would like to elaborate it now. You have mentioned about the incident of Nagarwala in your book, but you haven't gone too deep in it. What I want to understand is how has that impacted its trust, because people were just starting to build trust in SBI, and this incident happened. If you could tell us about what that incident was for our viewers' benefit, and also how did it affect its trust, and post that incident, what steps did SBI take to avoid such kind of incidences in future?
Nagarwala was a very interesting episode about which the chairman R.K. Talwar himself talks a lot about it. And it was a very, a call comes to the chief treasurer in Delhi where somebody mimics the prime minister saying, I'm calling from the prime minister's office, and then mimics the prime minister saying 60 lakh rupees to be deposited, given to a person in 100 rupee denomination. And the person got fooled. There was a password exchange saying कि आप कहाँ के हो, he'll say मैं हिंदुस्तान का हूँ, और वो बोलेगा मैं बांग्लादेश का हूँ, and things like that. Luckily, the money was caught. The reason, Purva, I didn't elaborate on the episode because I tried to do some research on trying to find out. Unfortunately, Nagarwala and the senior inspector both died within a year of the incident. And there was one police officer who died a few years back. Despite a lot of interrogation, there was no way people could find what exactly had happened. The money was recovered except for 4,000 rupees, but people were not able to find the real, so to say, the story behind it. And the reason I didn't go into details in the book was because actually it was a dead end. Even today, if you just Google about the Nagarwala episode, you would find that it was a dead end, and even though a few committees were formed, they could not really get to the bottom of it. But yes, after that, SBI took efforts to ensure that such a thing did not happen by creating checks and balances. Despite that, in the Harshad Mehta scam, SBI was one of the first banks to actually, they just managed to save themselves by the skin of teeth, because they got back the money, because SBI was alerted and Harshad Mehta ensured that the money came back from Grindlays Bank. But SBI, again, it was one individual in SBI, because of which the Harshad Mehta scam, SBI was one of the main kind of, so to say, the persons involved in it, but they got away clean. So they again saved themselves thanks to, again, quick reaction and action taken by SBI. But these things have happened. But it really did not affect a common man's belief in SBI, because they still believed that the bank was not doing any fraud. Yes, one could get cheated. In a very large system, it's possible. But if you look at the incidents of frauds which have taken place over the last 40, 50 years in India, very surprisingly, you will find that SBI does not picture in most of them.
Yeah, given its sheer presence and its
Sheer
large
size
scale.
with 24,000 branches with a
Yeah,
few lakh employees, it's actually very remarkable
absolutely.
that SBI does not figure in it.
Right, and its geographical, diversification also, and in a massive scale that SBI did. Do you think that any commercial bank, would have done it at that point of time? Maybe not in the 1950s, but probably in the next 2 decades or so. The way SBI expanded itself, do you think any commercial bank would have done it, or is it just because you had really good leaders at the helm of the bank that you could that SBI could achieve this kind of massive diversification?
See, if you look at, I'm not trying to get technical, but a little bit of understanding. I mean, what is banking? It's very simple. You take money from people, deposits, you give money to people, which is loans, and you manage transactions between two accounts. So you act as a, so it's banking is in a very simple sense. It's a very simple to understand business, but it's very complex the moment you start realizing to do it at scale. Now, talking about privatization, there has been a lot of clamor on private banks in India. If you look at it over the last 30, 40 years, there are just 3 or 4 names which really come to your mind, which have been very successful, like ICICI Bank, Axis Bank, HDFC Bank, and Kotak Bank. Maybe just these 4 banks.
Yeah.
Very surprising for a size of India, for the kind of entrepreneurship India has. Despite government opening up and giving licenses to so many people, you find that except for these 4 names, you don't really get names about private banks being so eminently successful. And which is where SBI really stands out as a bank which could achieve not just the scale at which it is today, not just in India, in so many other countries, and the kind of profitability it continues to maintain, the way it manages its books, and the way the culture of trust and integrity continues to be across all these 24,000 plus branches in India itself. Very, very few, as I mentioned, just the 3 or 4 private banks, and they are much smaller in scale, I mean, Kotak or others, compared to what SBI could do, shows its ability to be able to manage scale. Now, the YONO app, if I talk about, is considered one of the most successful apps developed by any bank. And some people value that as much as the bank itself in terms of its what it could be valued if were an independent entity today. So that speaks volumes about the way a very, very large organization, and as the chairman said, the elephant is still ready to dance. So it's not over yet. It's just 200 years of SBI.
Yeah, 200 years is what you have also mentioned in your book, that the chairman thinks there's 200 years also. But there's one more part that the book kind of would like to divide, is that the post-liberalization era. In the last 30 years, as you also mentioned, private banks also gave up, although there aren't many. But yes, the HDFCs and the ICICIs and the Axis Bank, all these banks could evolve, and they had technology to their advantage, and they kind of fine-tuned and did a lot of changes within them. Like for ICICI and Axis Bank, which was earlier UTI Bank, they did a lot of changes and technology was with them. How was it for SBI to adopt to it, to be competitive? Because the kind of market share that SBI had in say 1970s wasn't the same in 2005, maybe. The market share fell down. The profit per employee also went down. So how did SBI manage all of this? How did it manage to turn around and still be the largest bank that we have in the country currently?
Very interesting. In fact, D.N. Ghosh talks about it in his book when he was the chairman of SBI, that, the bank computerization was a very significant milestone and kind of a difficult milestone to achieve, because there was a lot of resistance at that point in time in the 70s mid 70s for the bank to nationalize because people believed that they're going to lose their jobs. There won't be any recruitment. I'll become redundant and so on and so forth. And DN Ghosh managed to achieve that, which was one of the significant achievements for the bank. But if you look at a lot of other initiatives, I have many of my friends who owe their career in investment banking to SBI Capital Markets, as it is called SBI Caps. And SBI Caps was one of the first companies to be so successful in managing so many IPOs, acting as an investment banker, despite the fact that many of the clients would have taken loans from the state bank. So in some sense, there's a clash of interest where I'm trying to consult a client who also has a relationship with my parent. But there was a Chinese wall. It was managed beautifully. And today, a lot of people owe their careers to what they started with SBI Capital Markets. Same with SBI Mutual Fund. If you look at SBI Cards today, which started as a joint venture with GE Capital, SBI Cards again is a leader in its area. Not a lot of people know about it because it's not mentioned so much in print. But the SBI Life Insurance Company again is extremely successful and in the top 3 life insurance companies in India today, thanks to SBI's branch network. So in all areas, whether you look at mutual funds, credit cards, investment banking, life insurance, and general insurance, the State Bank of India and its subsidiaries, they're all part of SBI Cards and all listed. And again, it's a very profitable growth story from an IPO perspective. Most of the other entities are within the SBI and they all continue to do extremely well. So it's really remarkable for a bank of that size to create such subsidiaries, and all of them either leaders or close to leaders in their respective areas.
But I'm sure the challenges were, given its sheer scale and the number of employees, the challenges were to change the psychology of employees around. You've also mentioned in your book where you give good number of pages dedicated to how the employee turnaround, the mentality of the employee had to be changed, and what all was done for it. Maybe the number of hours they had to be open, the bank had to be open, or how they had to be receptive to the customer, how customer first policy came into being. So if you could talk about that.
Yes, there's a very long mention of it by Chairman O.P. Bhatt about how he transformed when he became the chairman. He realized that there was a need now with liberalization in the 90s to ensure that the bank was as nimble, as customer oriented, and I talk about that in the book. And O.P. Bhatt, in fact, mentions in great detail about how he made each and every employee realize that the employee needed to be completely customer oriented. And it was a challenge, which you would see typically in many public sector organizations where there's a little bit of a laid back attitude, a little bit of a monopolistic, thinking that, well, I'm the bank and people are going to come to me. I don't need to go to them. And O.P. Bhatt really transformed the bank to ensure that the bank became customer oriented, and they really felt that they need to go out and get customers rather than customers coming to the bank. And it was a massive transformation exercise which was carried out with IIM Ahmedabad and some other consultants with the bank. And I think, again, a lot of these initiatives come from top down in terms of the chairman playing a huge role. And a series of chairpersons in SBI, including Arundhati Bhattacharya, the first woman chairperson for SBI, played significant role in ensuring that the bank continued to be nimble, customer oriented, business oriented in seeing what kind of businesses they want to get in, and yet remain relevant for, because sometimes when you want to be business oriented, you could become irrelevant for a lot of customers. And SBI had to balance saying that we are a state bank, we want to take all people together, at the same time ensure that profit is not compromised. So I think it's a great balance the bank plays, which private sector banks could afford to, do it their way because they're not really questioned by the government in terms of how they should be running the bank.
Mm-hmm. And before we wrap up, there's one important point that I would like to ask to you. It's about the NPAs, the growing NPAs. And again, that's something that you would not like to touch upon in the book as much. If you could talk about it here. There's still a problem with the NPAs in the public sector banks, like, be it the management of it or the other aspects, but between private banks and the public sector banks, the NPAs in the public sector banks are always higher. Also because maybe the government projects, it gives a loan to government projects. So what is it for SBI to kind of, also going forward? Is there any way they can control the growing NPAs? Or because even if we talk about numbers, then in the last 7 years itself, the NPAs of or SBI 1.21 lakh crores. So is there anything that will kind of shake customers in confidence in SBI because of it?
To answer that, no, but let me, so it was something I thought about, Purva, that should I touch upon this because it's a very hot topic today. People talk about NPAs. So let me give you a few points which I thought where what I felt about it. Number one, I think there are a lot of ex-chairmen of State Bank themselves who are writing their memoirs, including the latest one which has come out, where the chairman talks about his days, and he covers the aspect of NPA, which I thought they're more suited to talk about it than I could as an outsider. Secondly, if you look at a bank of the size of SBI, and if you look at any very, very large project where there are multiple lenders, in most places you'll find either SBI is a part of the consortium or SBI is actually leading the consortium. So there's no way that SBI would not be a part of a very large lending, and it invariably, as the largest bank, tends to become a part of that lending project itself. By default, it does mean that some of those NPAs would come to SBI's book. But if you were to look at the last few years of even newspaper headlines, you find banks like Punjab National Bank and some of the other public sector banks being hauled up, people being, cases against them. You don't find that about the State Bank of India. So to that extent, I feel, and I've really not got into much details about that in this book, but to that extent, you surely see a difference between public sector banks and State Bank of India. So there is some way in which this SBI is being managed much better than there are many other public sector banks in it, including Canara Bank, the Punjab National Bank, the Bank of Baroda, so many of them. But you don't find so much of criticism against SBI as you see against other public sector banks. But yes, given the fact that it is India's largest lender, they would be involved in many transactions which would lead to an NPA. But to answer your question, does it shake the confidence of a common man in SBI? I think the answer is very clearly no, because SBI continues to be extremely profitable, extremely successful, and the way it's serving its customers. So I don't see that as a risk at all.
Absolutely. And, as Mr. R.K. Talwar has also said, that it is the biggest bank for the smallest man.
For the smallest
so, with that, thank you so much for talking to us. And I would like to tell our viewers that this is about 200 pages odd book, 194 to be precise, and it is written in a very simple, clear language, very compelling, and even for a person who's not very business or economic savvy, that person can also understand this is not about jargons, the big jargons, but this is about SBI story and how it was born, and its story which dates back to 2 centuries. So definitely do read this book. And thank you, Mr. Pandey, for joining us, taking time out and talking to ThePrint on this soft cover.
My pleasure.